ESPN layoffs, a potential Pac-12 media deal, and no Andrew Marchand? Don't worry, we have it covered.
I'm holding, Paul.
And we're back. The Marchand and Ourand Sports Media Podcast. I'm John Ourand, media reporter for the Sports Business Journal. And he's not Andrew Marchand, who's a sports media columnist for the New York Post. He's Paul Finebaum, the host of a daily 4-hour radio show that's simulcast on ESPN's SEC network, known as the voice of the SEC. But of course, you know all the college conferences. What I especially like about you, Paul, is your journalistic chops. Back in the day, award-winning columnist for the Birmingham Post-Herald, the Mobile Press Register. One of my favorite people in the business. Paul, thank you for filling in as guest host today. Incredible upgrade for us from Marchand.
Yeah, John, and let me say too, on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Worldwide Leader, we are more than happy that Marchand is off this week because we're tired. We're tired of refreshing his Twitter feed to see whether we'll be around for the next couple of years.
And by the way, I shout out to Andrew Marchand, who did that while on vacation. I mean, that's dedication to the job there. Well done.
It was insane. I walked back from lunch on Friday, and it was, to say the least, a terrible day at ESPN. But I asked one of my colleagues. I said, "So what's the latest?" He said, "Oh, let me refresh Andrew's Twitter feed for a second." I mean, literally, that was the life that all of us people were living on maybe the worst day we've ever had. But I say that jokingly about Andrew, but he's done quite a good job of knowing a lot more than anyone else.
Well, let's get right into our show. Who's up? Who's down?
Who's up? Who's down?
Paul, I'm going to lead us off. We have you on the pod, so this is sort of a college media edition of the show. Although with everything that happened at ESPN, of course, we're going to get into that in a little bit. But my who's up is the SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey. You, of course, remember it was just 8 years ago. We had Mike Slive at the SEC. He had been in the job for about 2 decades. Jim Delaney at the Big Ten, who had been there for more than 3 decades. We had John Swofford at the ACC. He had a quarter-century reign at the ACC. So at the time, it was really Slive, Delaney, and Swofford who ran college sports. And today, is there any question that it's Sankey? In fact, it's been Sankey almost upon the day in 2015 that he became SEC commissioner. Well, actually, it was probably about 5 years after that when Delaney left that it became absolutely certain. There's a reason to me why the SEC has no drama. There's a reason why the SEC's football and basketball programs, both men's and women's, have been so dominant, and it all goes back to Sankey.
My who's up is personal because, John, I covered this individual when he was in high school. That's how long I've known Charles Barkley. And I'm not here to talk about how great he is on television. That's been established by you and many of your colleagues. But he did something the other day, and this is politics aside. I stay away from that at all costs. But after the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, agree with it or not, he decided to redo his will. Now, I don't know how you decided to redo your will on the spur of the moment, but Charles Barkley figured out a way to do that. And he decided to leave $5 million to Auburn University, his alma mater, to help keep Auburn diverse. And I just found that to be a remarkable gesture by Charles, because a lot of people talk a big game and say, tweet about how wrong politics are and this politician or some Supreme Court ruling. But Charles actually puts his money where his mouth is, although that's a big mouth to fill up with a lot of money. But I was really struck by that. And aside from that, he did something else which really impressed me last week. He did what all of us have wanted to do for at least the last 25 years, and that's call Skip Bayless an idiot.
and that you just did that. Thank you very much. Since you went into Skip Bayless, why don't you take who's down now, Paul?
Who's down is absolutely confusing. And I'm a golf fan, but I would not normally be a consumer of the Rocket Mortgage Classic in Detroit. It's just not something without some of the bigger names I was interested in. But I put it on Saturday afternoon for a minute, and I saw Ricky Fowler is near the leaderboard. I said, yeah, okay, I'm in for that. I'm a big Ricky Fowler fan, and then I find out it's going to be on in the morning. So I scramble around and I see some of the holes on ESPN Plus and Peacock and all that. And then as it's getting interesting, Fowler has a lead, he loses a lead. Well, it goes radio silent. I mean, all of a sudden, I don't know what Peacock's mentality is or what their plans are. I don't know what the Golf Channel's protocol is, but all I know is, like many Americans and people around the world, I found myself trying to find the end of this golf tournament on a sports app, and I thought we were beyond that in today's world. And I think it finally showed up on the CBS Sports app. So I don't even know who's down. John, is it CBS? They had to start the tournament early because of weather, and it was the right decision. So it was on in the afternoon on tape delayed. Is it the Golf Channel, who I don't know what they have on in the middle of the day? I'm sure how to get out of a bunker during a rainstorm. I have no earthly idea. Peacock moved on to something else, but it was a total fail. And I think the golf world was a loser. I mean, I almost started searching for the Live Tour, but I had no earthly idea how to find it.
I'm going to give the who's down to the PGA Tour as a sort of all encompassing for you there. Well, my who's down, again, I know this is a college sports media, but my who's down has to be Bob Iger, who's the CEO of Disney. And what's the reason for actually doing the layoffs? It's to look good on Wall Street, right? Well, when Bob Iger first announced that Disney and ESPN would be laying off thousands of employees, this was back in March, Disney's stock price was at 94. At the time of this podcast, as we're talking, it's at 89. The stock price is down since the time when Iger started layoffs that affected thousands of families. It also hit scores of people who bleed ESPN, people like Patrick Stigman, who's the longtime editorial director for the company, who announced just last week that he was part of these layoffs. Doing this in 4 stages as well, it just seems especially cruel. It is especially cruel. And it's not done yet. There's still an unknown number of people with expiring contracts that are not going to be renewed over the coming months. So I was very happy personally to see that the stock price did not soar as a result of these layoffs. And I am hopeful, Paul, that companies will be more judicious in using layoffs as a strategy to look good on Wall Street and actually try to make their business better. And that brings us to our first topic, and that's the ESPN layoffs that occurred on Friday before July 4th. Talk about a Friday news dump of the July 4th weekend. The New York Post, Andrew Marchand's not here, but the New York Post headline referred to ESPN as the worldwide bleeder. There was about 20 on-air stars: Jeff Van Gundy, Jalen Rose, Suzy Kolber, Keyshawn Johnson, Max Kellerman. I'm not going to name all 20. You can look at them, but those are sort of the biggest names. On the college beat, College Game Days, David Pollack was laid off. I personally was most surprised by Van Gundy, who I consider to be the best NBA game analyst in the business. I'm not sure if I understand the reasoning behind that. These layoffs were people that had contracts that are not expiring. So they run for 1, 2, in some cases 3 or 4 more years. So ESPN is committed to paying these people through their contracts. They just can't be on ESPN anymore. And if they get another job on another network, they have to come back to ESPN and negotiate their contracts. Paul, you are an on-air talent for ESPN. You host a show that's on SEC Network. You appear on almost all the ESPN studio shows. What's the morale like over there?
It's pretty tough. And I say that loving my job and loving the company, but it was the worst day in my 10 years at ESPN. And I can't explain Bob's thinking. I think you have to trust his track record, but it doesn't really excuse the state of mind that a lot of us, if not all of us, were in. And I say, as an employee, nobody knew Friday, especially those of us who were on the air, whether we would be around at the end of the day. And I'll spare you a lot of the things that have been said on Twitter and on social media, because it's a special place to work, but it can be cruel, and I think because most of the names were very well known, far better than mine. There's a chirping out there. There's a lot of Schadenfreude from, hey, look what happened to him or to her, but it still hurts. And I was probably most touched by Suzy Kolber when I read her announcement that she was leaving. I mean, it really got to me, because that's somebody who has been in front of the camera there for 30 years and who broke a lot of barriers down for women. And that one really got to me. Some of the other ones you accept. Van Gundy, he's been there before. He's an NBA coach. Some of the other players have been in the NBA, but those of us who are not athletes and who have not experienced those lights, I think it affects in a little bit of a different way. Does it make you angry? Yes, but who can you be angry with? Because the people that were let go, John, they weren't taken off the air because they were inefficient or incompetent. It was a business decision, and that's the part that you have to understand when you work there. And there's good and there's bad. And I'll tell you a quick story. I was having lunch a couple of years ago in New York with Mark Shapiro, who at one time was a senior executive at ESPN and now is one of the top executives at WME, as you know. And he told me that about 3 weeks after I think he left ESPN to go to work for Danny Snyder at one of his companies. I think it was Six Flags. I may have that backwards. Yeah. And it was for an enormous amount of money. He came back to the industry, obviously, and he said that he had like his air conditioning guy come to his house a couple weeks later, and he answered it early in the morning. He had an ESPN T-shirt on, and the air conditioner guy said, "Hey, I'm here, blah, blah, blah." He said, "You work at ESPN?" And Shapiro goes, No, I used to work there. I now work." And he explained. He said, "Why would you leave ESPN?" And it resonated with me because it is that special. There's nothing like it. There's no other company in the sports platform like ESPN. And all of us who have worked there or who one time did are proud of that existence, which makes Friday so bad, which makes Friday such a watershed day, a day that you start wondering. And in the end, I know most of those people who were let go. I can tell you, none of them lost their job because they weren't outstanding at what they do. It was a simple return on not return on investment, but it was simply a ledger move for the company. And you already said it, and I can't add to what you said about the state of sports media and where we are.
So, Paul, you referenced this a little bit earlier. And it's inconceivable to me that somebody like you that has such a big name and has a hit show would feel angst on Friday. But they did say there are no sacred cows, although there are a handful of sacred cows. Take me through your Friday. What was your sort of angst level? What was your mentality like when you got that first email saying this is going to be the day?
Yeah, you knew we were close, and I say this in full disclosure. And I used to be on the other side, meaning I worked at news organizations. We really don't know, and I'm not blaming anyone because there are a lot of management people that I deal with that have faced similar situations. As you know, you talked about one of my direct report. You talked about her last week in terms of the games that go on in terms of positioning. And so it's not like people say you're good or most of what we know as employees either comes through gossip mongering agents. And I say that because they know certain things, but they don't know everything, but primarily from the media. I'm not kidding you. About 6 or 8 weeks ago, Andrew called me. He left me a message. I was at the dentist of all places. I got out of the dentist chair, and right after you have your teeth worked on, the one thing you don't want to see is a voicemail from Andrew Marchand right in the middle of the I mean, I was like, this is it. I mean, and I say that not as somebody who's insecure, but it's the times that we live in. And when I called him, it was completely unrelated. He had a question he had to ask me about something that goes on in this part of the world that obviously you know better than I do. He's not that familiar with, but that's how it is. And I'm not saying anything other than that's what I think most people deal with. And I heard your podcast last week about the sacred cows, and there are very few, I think, and I know I'm not one of them, and most of the people I work with are not one of them. So yes, you are concerned because you know the company is dealing with whatever they're dealing with, and when you see names like the ones that went down on Friday, who wouldn't be worried?
So the Paul Finebaum of today, we're taping this on July 3rd. Do you have survivor's guilt, or what's sort of going through right now?
You do have that at some point. About 5 years ago, during one of the layoffs, John, I remember not being sure, because you don't know. I had a friend in the industry who called and checked on me, and I said, I think we're okay, but I don't know. I walked in the building, and I work out of the Charlotte studio. So although obviously I'm in Bristol and in New York quite a bit throughout, especially during the season. And I walked in, and the person in front of me was stopped as I was walking in to flash my card. And I waited for a second, and I watched that individual get laid off. And it was painful to see. And by the way, it's not like I don't know many people, or many people that have been through this, but it's a reality, but it's also the part of the business that really brings it home. And I'm not asking for sympathy here. We are very fortunate to be in this spot, and I spent a long time as a newspaper person, looking at television people with scorn and with contempt. So I feel like I understand both sides of it. But and I'm not I won't overwhelm you with hackneyed cliches that you know what you're getting into, but you do, or you should. And I've had plenty of people text me over the weekend. Are you okay? I mean, in fact, you asked me about Friday, and I got off the subject. I went out at lunch. I got in, and we saw some of the names. I went out to grab a smoothie for lunch. This was no day to be gone for long. And as I'm walking out of the Smoothie King, which is around the corner from our office, a lady walked up to me and she said, "Are you Paul Finebaum?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I watch your show." I said, "Well, thank you very much." And as I was getting into my car, she said, you haven't been laid off yet." And I'm like going, I mean, but that's part of it. And I said, "Not yet." I got back to the office a minute later, and we learned of more people. And our guys who were in that day producing, I mean, what are you're preparing a show, but you're also, how can you not be looking and seeing what is happening around you?
We could spend an entire podcast on this, but you're so plugged into the college sports space, and I want to pivot now. A couple of the big media stories in college sports. One of the stories that every time we write about the Pac-12, or anytime we talk about the Pac-12, there's such interest in their media deal, what's going to happen with their media deal. Where do you see that right now, Paul?
Well, it's just a continual story that every time I hear or see a tweet, Pac-10 years deal, I just shrug my shoulders. I was with the president of the University of Arizona a couple of weeks ago in DC at a summit about NIL, and I asked him, because he was the host, and he said, "I think we're really close to a deal." Now, John, how many times have you reported that? All that tells me is that they're going nowhere, and that doesn't mean by the time we get off the air here today, and this is published, that they may have one. But the fact that if they get one, it won't be a good one, and I think that league is very diminished. and you still have rumors all over the place. The day I was with the Arizona president, there were rumors that Arizona and Colorado were heading to the Big 12. You have the continual Oregon, Washington rumors. So I don't think they'll ever be able to put those fires out, even with a new deal, even if it's with Apple or Amazon or some cobbled together group. They're still in big trouble.
Yeah, I feel pretty safe in saying by the time this publishes, which is actually 2 days from now, there will be no deal. There's been a lot of talk on message boards over the weekend about Apple doing a potential deal where they would stream a lot of that. I've been told that is not necessarily close, and I don't know. I don't understand. Here's sort of my frustration. If I was a Pac-12 fan, is why would the University of Arizona president continuously put these false deadlines out of we're close? They're not especially close, but they're not far either. I mean, I'm looking at it at like a Big 12 sort of situation, to where if you get, I expect, and this is sort of informs speculation, that they're going to have something. They're going to know where they're going to go in probably a month, and they'll have an actual announcement around Labor Day for the next deal. And I know we always love to talk about, ESPN's out, NBC's out, CBS is out, and a lot of those talks have cooled. I don't like to say that they're out because they're just cooling. They're waiting until a deal comes that they can afford. But there is a deal to be had for the Pac-12. And I just think that it's the presidents and the commissioner that have put these false deadlines on, that when inevitably they don't meet them, then it does look like your house is on fire.
Well, you're expecting college administrators to shoot straight with media. So.
When has that ever happened? How seriously do you take the rumors of an Arizona and Colorado going to the Pac-12, or the Big Ten taking over a couple of the West Coast colleges?
I think it's possible, because to the Big 12's credit, and this was a league that I wouldn't have spit on 2 years ago when Oklahoma and Texas went to the SEC. I mean, it looked like they were broke. They had nowhere to turn, and give Brett Yormark credit. I mean, he walked in there. He really inherited a dumpster fire, and he has turned that into, I think, the third most attractive conference in the country right now, behind the Big Two, the SEC and the Big Ten. And so I think it's viable. And I think if you're Oregon and Washington, you probably do want to go to the Big Ten. Of course you do. Now, again, I don't know what they're going to be able to do, as you alluded to, but I would want out. I would not want to be part of the Pac-12 anymore, because I think their future is bleak. And we already have an issue in college athletics with the SEC and the Big Ten have just literally left everyone else behind from a television standpoint. So it's the race is now to be number 3. The Pac-12 has no shot at that. And the ACC is really struggling, and I know we'll talk about that in a second. But so if you're a member of the Pac-12, I mean, you literally are going to the dollar store looking for other schools, and I'm sure the folks at San Diego State won't appreciate that. But I mean, they were hot to trot a couple of days ago, and I don't know what happened there. And then there are other schools that they're talking to about certain things, but why would you want to be in that league if you could get out?
Here's a question that I have: is I understand the Big 12 wanting to expand. That makes perfect sense to me. Convince me, as a current Big 10 president, why adding Oregon and Washington to divide up our media rights pie even further makes sense.
You're going to force me to admit that the Big Ten made a mistake with Maryland and Rutgers to get to this point.
Just Rutgers, Paul. Come on.
Well, I had a funny couple of years ago. I landed bleary-eyed at about 11:45 at LaGuardia, and the first thing I saw was welcome to Big Ten country. And I swear at that I don't know how many drinks I'd had on the plane, but I could not come up with the Big Ten school that was connected to New York. But I think back to the question, they really don't need them, and knowing the intricacies of conference realignment, it takes a long time to bring a school in. I've watched this in the SEC a couple of times, and it's a nightmare from a scheduling standpoint. But I think it's a grab right now, and they're attractive. And why do you want them? Because people are interested in watching Oregon and Washington. They're very big names and very big brands. And forget geography. We've exhausted that conversation.
Let's move on to the Big Ten. They're about to start their new media deal. Still not signed yet, amazingly enough. There's still a couple of things that NBC's trying to get out of it. No problems there. It's going to get signed. NBC's going to have the primetime game. CBS is going to have the late afternoon game, and Fox is going to have the big noon window game. So that is set, and the Big Ten network will take everything else. What does that hold up there? Like what do you read into sort of their new media deal that's coming out?
The only thing I can read into it is that the previous commissioner, Kevin Warren, just either was hasty or his lawyers were sidetracked, because there's never an explanation of why you can't get these deals done once you have the agreement to do so. I don't think it's a big deal, but I will offer this on the Big Ten. And I know those of us in the southern part of the world are supposed to turn our hold our nose and turn our face, but I thought the deal last year was remarkable. I thought it was one of the better moments that we've seen in college sports. To get Southern Cal to make that trek over to the Big Ten, to pull off an NFL-like deal, I was flabbergasted how well they did with it. And that takes nothing away from the SEC, which has an amazing deal as well. And I think it will get better in time. But that was a major coup. So I think you just get expansion hungry. And whether it's greed or whether it makes common sense, I can't make a compelling argument what Oregon and Washington bring other than the brand value, and I think that's what it's about.
You have one of their first games that they're going to have is that big Maryland versus Charlotte game, which I might be the only household watching that game, Paul. But it's going to be tough sometimes, because sometimes they're going to have the fourth pick for a primetime game. And what's the fourth pick in the Big Ten? All of a sudden you're looking at Northwestern versus Illinois or something, like just kind of not a marquee game that's out there. Does that concern you at all? Like, would that concern you if you were a media executive?
The problem is the inventory is going to be skewed, which is, I think, one reason, back to your previous question, John, why Oregon and Washington would help that. But ultimately, consumers of college football, outside of those loyalists like you who would watch a Maryland game.
Maryland Charlotte is. I actually went. I have tickets for that game, so I'm going to be going to that game.
I remember that. I think that game was in Charlotte last year. I remember I had a friend from Maryland that believe it or not, came in for it. But the point being, the consumers of college football keep an eye on the scoreboard, and if Maryland and Charlotte are tied going into the final couple of minutes, we'll all flip over there. But other than that, the tune-in is going to be very low. So I think it's the real. I think we'll have a glut. I know college football fans say there's never too much, and that's why the NFL has good numbers the way they do it. But I think you're going to see some bizarrely low numbers for games. And I'm ranking that one high on my list of bad ratings.
It'll get great ratings in my household, Paul. You have several times been, I don't want to say negative because that's such a pejorative word, but you've been rather negative about the ACC and their media future. Why is that?
Well, part of it concerns the deal they have, of course, with ESPN. So it's always an interesting journey to talk about such things like this. But it goes into the mid 2035 or something like that. And I think with expansion, you have a number of very anxious schools. Florida State's been bold about it. The president of Florida State has spoken about it. Clemson, others as well, who probably, if they could get out without a severe penalty, would be gone. And there would be suitors. It would be between North Carolina, Virginia, Clemson, Florida State, maybe Miami. The SEC and the Big Ten would probably be interested parties for a lot of reasons. But they can't get out, and they've been pretty vocal about it. And at the recent ACC meetings, there was a lot said. In fact, I interviewed Mac Brown the other day, and he joked about the phrase somebody used for describing the Magnificent Seven, those who would leave if they could, but they can't leave. And it's a long story, and I won't tell the whole story. But if you go back a number of years, the ACC wanted what the SEC and the Big Ten had, and that was its own network. And ESPN made a deal. They gave them the ACC network, and in return, they signed this grant of rights deal for a very long time, which seemed like a good deal at the time.
I'm not sure about that, because when they launched that network, cord cutting wasn't just a theory; it was actually happening. I
have never really completely understood it, but sometimes, John, you want what the guy down the street has, and having watched the SEC almost go to a network at the same time as the Big Ten, and they paused and they waited, and then having, you mentioned Bob Iger earlier, he described the SEC network as the most successful cable launch ever, considering what it had in terms of distribution. That's a word that not exactly operative anymore, but it was a bit. I was the first person hired by the SEC network, so I was in on a lot of meetings with Dish and DirecTV. In fact, I did a commercial for Dish, trying to get people to sign up. I mean, it was a different. I mean, this is only 10 years ago, and to think how different that world was, and the SEC came in at an unbelievable amount in terms of not full distribution. I mean, there were a couple of pockets in Brooklyn that couldn't get us, but a lot of folks could.
Yeah, I love the Dish deal. I think Dish they were the first ones to come on board. They never took sports networks, but they were first ones to come on board with the SEC network. It turns out Charlie Ergen's a big alum of an SEC school.
That always matters, and so is the president and CEO of Apple. He went to Auburn, but I mean, but the Dish, that was a big part of it, and but it was such a different world. And back to what you said about the ACC, I really don't completely understand it. There may have been a connection to John Skipper, who was the president of ESPN at the time, and he was
a big North Carolina alum, as you know. Yeah,
and I mean that was a move that really ruffled feathers, talking inside baseball, because the SEC felt like that had been promised that would never happen, and when it did, there was a sub-zero temperature relationship between the SEC and some top people at ESPN.
So let me ask you about Clemson and Florida State in particular, because they've been the most vocal about sort of wanting to get into the SEC. I don't see there as being a lot of suitors there, but maybe I'm overestimating the market. Like, you already have South Carolina with South Carolina, and you already have Florida with Florida. Like, what would entice the SEC to say, yeah, let's just spread our media money to these two extra schools when we already have those bases covered?
I think that's conventional wisdom, and the real question is, how do networks view the landscape today? Is a market important, or is a brand important? And I suspect the brand is becoming more important, because you're not going to add too many more households in South Carolina, but I'm not sure that's really the issue. And sometimes you get schools. I've heard North Carolina and Virginia just thrown up in the air as possibilities for the Big Ten. Why? Some of it has to do with academics, and I know that's a word hardly ever used.
I don't believe we've ever said that word once on this podcast, Paul. So
but the Big Ten loves to pride itself on having AAU sanctioned universities. I won't explain. That's not an athletic term. That's an academic term, and that means that you are top of the shelf And the only, I think, non-AAU school in the Big Ten is Nebraska.
I find that to be fascinating, and I think you're probably right, because when the Big Ten launched, we're going on like 20 years. I guess it's like 17 years ago. They wanted Rutgers for what you saw in LaGuardia. We get now the New York market, not for viewership, but because all of a sudden the cable operators and satellite companies had to have Big Ten network in New York, which just printed money. Same thing for Maryland in the whole DC DMA, DC Baltimore, and it is changing now, because you don't, with cord cutting and with streaming, you don't necessarily need to get into these markets so much. So you do want the biggest brands, which is something I've been sort of late to seeing. And you made a good point about that.
Yeah, John, if you go back 13 years ago, the Pac-12 came within a whisker of getting Texas. And that move was predicated more on academics, because Texas felt like it was in with a bunch of ne'er-do-wells in the Big 12, and they wanted to roll with Cal Berkeley and Stanford and UCLA and USC, and that almost happened too. But Texas A&M, politics got in the way, and ultimately here we are a couple of years, 13 years later, Texas has moved east as opposed to west.
Now, when I did my Who's Up today, I did it with Greg Sankey. I almost did Brett Yormark, because I have been so I just think that he's taken big risks and they've all paid off. Like he went big in terms of trying to get the media deal done early, and there was some risk to that, but he ended up beating the Pac-12 to the punch on that. You made an interesting comment earlier in this pod where you would rank the Big 12 potentially ahead of the ACC, which caught me off guard. Explain that a little bit.
Well, but I think you look at the four schools they've just taken in, you look at what they have a lot of momentum, and some of this may be, prisoner of the moment, with TCU having played for the national championship. Well, they didn't, they appeared in the national championship game. Let me refresh that. They didn't really play. They lost 65-3 or 6 or whatever it was. It was a disaster. But I like Yormark. I think he's making interesting deals. I think there's a lot of momentum. You don't have Big 12 schools looking around. You have schools looking to the Big 12. While even though I think Jim Phillips, who's now the ACC commissioner, really is somewhat handcuffed because of the previous deals, they seem to be a little bit stuck. And I think everything in our world, this because you talk about it every day and every week, is momentum, and the Big 12 has momentum, and I think the ACC is trying to find itself. I mean, that ACC, if you were a fly on the wall at the ACC spring meetings, I mean, it was chaos for a couple of days, and then they all came out and sang "Kumbaya," but nobody believed it. The Big 12 on the field this year will be interesting to watch with some of the new schools. Cincinnati's is a major addition, getting into Florida with UCF. Houston has a very successful program, and you go west as well with BYU. So there's a lot there, and you don't hear about the ACC expanding because they're stuck. And I think it comes. I'm sure I'll leave it to John Skipper to opine. I'm sure he's available, but I think that deal really took some of the wind out of their sails, and they also need to be relevant all the time. And Clemson was their leader for a number of years, and Clemson could get back in the national picture. They're not far from it, but going off the radar for a couple of years has not helped. What is the ACC known for? Basketball. I don't need to ask you about that. I mean, I think for too long the ACC stayed with basketball as its number one sport. And they realized, as great as basketball had been in the ACC, it's not enough. And college basketball is a subject for another day here, but it's also a diminished sport from a television standpoint.
Isn't that incredible? We don't talk about basketball when we talk about these media deals at all. One more quick question on the ACC: are we going to see Clemson and Florida State getting paid more than Wake Forest and Boston College? Is that something that's going to happen or no?
I mean, it's certainly on the table, and I think it's a bad thing to do. And if you wonder if dividing the pie up unevenly is a good idea, just ask Missouri and Nebraska and Texas A&M about how they dealt with Texas getting its own network. about 15 years ago. The Longhorn Network, which only has a few more months of existence, really did tremendous harm to the Big 12. And I think at least 3 members and maybe more bailed out as a result.
Well, Paul, if it's the Marchand and Ourand Sports Media podcast, we always have to end it with our call of the week.
Call of the week.
All right, with Andrew Marchand on vacation, I almost always use this spot to have Kevin Brown calling an Adley Rushman home run for the Orioles. However, the Orioles have been on a losing streak. Haven't been too many great calls. So I am going to go for a literal call of the week, and we have Jim from Tuscaloosa. Take it over, Jim.
No, you're not going to talk to me, Paul, but, you are a jerk. You really are a jerk. If you'll let me finish, I know you want to interrupt me like you did Cletus. That guy makes sense. I've added to the show, but you've stirred up all this crap over the last 10 or 15, or last 5 or 6 years against me. You caused these people to do this. You've made me mad, and I do lose my cool because it enrages me, the lies you've told about me. But again, you told me when I first got on the show, Paul, you said you're a very smart guy, you're compelling, you bring a lot to that. And when I was talking football, which you knew, I knew a lot about football, the way I talked about it. You knew that. You admitted that. But now you get on here and you want to condemn me. You want to make a mark out of me because you're like the Democrats, Paul, and I think you are a Democrat. But you want to bash me, and that makes your show. This whole day proves one thing. You make your show off me. You got no show without me. I said, and I don't say that braggadociously. It's a fact. You can't have a show now without me, without my name being brought. You bring it up. If I don't call for 3 weeks, you bring my name up every day because you don't get, like Cletus made points. He made real good points. The show is so stinking dull now, and I actually wanted to help you. I don't care about you anymore. I hope your show goes straight to hell because I hope you do too, because that's how horrible and mean and evil you are to me. You've been a personal evil menace to me. You really have. And I can't stand you. But I think you will fail because of the type of person you are. You have no character, Paul. You have no character. You're immorally corrupt. And I'm glad you finally let me say what I feel. And you've caused this because of the way you mistreated me. You hadn't treated me right. You treated me great when I helped your show the first few years and brought something that you wanted, which is sports talk. I don't do that anymore. I told you why.
Am I allowed to talk?
I finished.
Paul, what gives? He doesn't like you very much.
The Paul Finebaum show is known for a lot of things, but mostly it's known for callers. We had a caller named Harvey Updike call in 2011 that admitted to a felony live on the air of poisoning the tumors tree. But Jim from Tuscaloosa is probably the best known caller. And there's more to the story than even that rant. This is a guy, John, that has tried to convince the audience that he once was one of the greatest athletes in the world. And we got into a discussion one day. He got hurt in high school or something. He told me he had a AAA contract, but he decided not to do it. But I got into an argument with him one day about how good of a hitter he was. And we have the tape to back this up. And I said, were you how good a hitter? He said, I was an incredible hitter. I said, and I started throwing some names out from my youth. I said, just kind of went down the list. I said, so finally I got down to like maybe the third best hitter of all time or second best hitter. I said, were you better than Willie Mays? He said, oh yeah. He said, I was better. I said, so you're better than Willie Mays? I said, Hank Aaron, better than Hank Aaron. I said, Jim, Ted Williams is considered the greatest hitter in Major League Baseball history. Were you better than Ted Williams? He said, I was better than Ted Williams. He said it with you just heard the guy. I don't need to convince you. And to this day, he disputes that he said he was better than Ted Williams. He said he was as good as Ted.
It's a fine line there, Paul.
Very fine.
At what point, I love listening to the callers. It is, it's the best part of, most entertaining part of your show. At what point did you realize that was going to be such a gold mine for your show?
It was early on. We were in Birmingham, Alabama. We were not heard outside of there, and I couldn't get the big ESPNers, the big guests. So we people started calling in. We would pit them against each other, and it happened. And once we started moving up a little bit, we got on satellite radio in 2010. Then the Updike call happened, and there was that one call, John, the Harvey Updike call, that it was so chilling that this Alabama fan poisoned the most iconic monument, so to speak, at Auburn University, and he did it because he did it because Cam Newton had led Auburn down 24 points in Tuscaloosa to a win over Alabama, and they ended up winning the national championship. And we later found out that this guy Harvey Updike was a 63-year-old man who was a former state trooper in Texas. He was obsessed with Alabama. They found when they busted him, they found like 400 or 500 Alabama hats at his house. They later discovered that his son was named Bear in honor of Bear Bryant. His daughter was named Crimson Tide, Tyde, and he wanted to name. He named his dog Nick Saban. I mean, I don't need to offer a psychiatric evaluation, do I?
I thought I was a big Maryland fan. Apparently, I'm not. Amazing. Paul, I can't thank you enough for being a co-host. I thought this was fantastic. We're at the end of the pod, so it's a time to thank everybody for listening. Say, please go rate us 5 stars, comments, or whatever. But I'd love to have you back. I thought this was a lot of fun. I could go on for twice as long.
John, the pleasure was mine. I know there probably been better days for somebody like me to show up on this thing, but I deeply appreciate the invitation, and I'm a huge fan of this pod. Even Andrew.
But not those calls where he leaves the voicemail. Yeah, got it. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you especially, Paul Finebaum.